When I heard Spiral Scratch in particular, but some of the music that was going on then, I had liked, I talked about Agata in particular, but I liked that visceral noise. I was always very responsive to that sense of visceral noise. So even though, it's why I like Funkadelic, they were very visceral at a certain kind of point. So the way that I suppose punk, as we now think of it, prioritized that kind of visceral impact was something that I immediately responded to. I just thought, well, this is something that can cut through the crap in some, to put it simply. What that moment offered, and in retrospect, I can see that there were things happened that would not have happened if I hadn't been involved and done them. But at the same time, on reflection, it could have been me, it might have been somebody else, that you're sort of channeling things that are happening. It's not that you sit down and really plan them. But I think it was this combination of very simple, visceral piece of music combined with some really intelligent understanding of music, because the intelligence involved in punk was interestingly at odds with the apparent visceral simplicity of the music. And some of the most intellectual punks made the crudest music, which was an interesting tension. And I think it was the possibility of working with that, having that visceral connection, but also strategically using it to unsettle things. I mean, I from day one wanted the music to... I thought I was making hit records from day one. That's what I was interested in and thought I was doing. Obviously, I actually wasn't. But I believed I was, because I believed I was engaged in a strategy to get this stuff in everyone's face. I think learning lessons was not our strength. We thought we were teaching people things. So I'm not sure what we learned. I mean, 2.3 was... It's funny, some people have come to really like it. At the time, I think it was perceived as us trying too hard. Relatively speaking, it was recorded and produced with great sophistication compared to what we'd done before. And that was partly to try and adjust for the difficulty of getting the Mekons to be a hit. I thought, okay, well, we'll explore actually figuring out how you're supposed to do this a bit. And it sort of did or didn't, it sort of didn't work in that sense, in that it didn't have the provocative value of the Mekons, but it wasn't commercial in some sense. I mean, I used elements that other people brought to the table. Certainly some of the later ones, I used photos, for example, that Hilary took, but that was my bag. Now, that was often, that kind of, we would wrestle with the bands around that, because, of course, some of them, they were aligned with our thinking, but equally, there was that punk thing of it being about self-determination. And that wasn't a notion that we bought into as a label. We thought notions of self-determination were illusory, including our own. I mean, I used to say at the time, we were by the time we're talking about, we were starting to be labeled an independent record label, which I always thought was just very funny, because as we were, as an undercapitalized small business, we were a lot more dependent on things than a big multinational. My view was we were a dependent record label, not an independent one. So, that idea of self-determination kind of didn't wash with me. And so sometimes we would do the packaging in the most dramatically and obviously with the Gang of Four, directly in opposition to the band's expressed wishes. It was quite a part of the MO was to be quite contentious. I mean, I passionately believed in what the bands were doing, and I never ever thought that anything the label did itself was more important than what they did. And the only reason the label existed, or I was doing what I was doing, was because what these bands did. But following on from our sense that how the audience enjoyed them was mediated by all these other things, whether it was the packaging or the marketing or what you said to the press or whatever, and that these things all mattered and were a part of the process, we didn't think that a respect for what the band did meant that we didn't bring something else to the table in that chain. But there would be huge ideological battles in the studio about whether or not there should be reverb on something and whether that was selling out and stuff like that. And I just didn't care about any musical rules. In certain respects, I would argue that from a musical point of view, I was probably more of a punk than half our bands, in that I had, if it somehow worked or had an attitude that I thought was interesting, I absolutely didn't care about musically what rules it transgressed. And very rapidly, punk itself settled into an incredibly antiquated and geriatric set of rules about what was and wasn't punk, which, we were already completely uninterested in. I don't know how they heard of me or the label, but they sent Being Boiled and a bunch of other incredible things through in a cassette in a post. Just popped up one day with, interestingly enough, it had 2 bits of paper in it. I remember very clearly. One was a sheet of mylar, which is that shiny kind of silvery material, with some statements felt penned on it, or maybe the lyrics, I don't know. And then it had a bit of that old school computer printout with kind of a manifesto typed on it. So they were kind of already, in the area of what we do. I was already intrigued. Then when I listened to the material, particularly Being Boiled, and I guess probably Circus of Death, and I think one or both of them were on this very first tape, I suddenly thought I was listening to a Parliament record. That's where actually what I was listening to before suddenly kind of kicked in that, it had that massive, big, fat bass that drove the whole thing, and I kind of got that. But I got that through the filter of Bootsy Collins rather than because I'd been a Kraftwerk fan. And then the other thing that intrigued me about it was the very strange combination of apparently incredibly significant and important lyrics that also insisted on being completely meaningless and poppy at the same time. And I loved that tension. So they had me straight away. And I'd put the record out before I ever met them. I don't know if we even spoke on the phone. I just wrote back and said, yeah, great, I want to put it out now. I would argue that all the work we'd done to create this brand, which said this brand is not about what you expect. This brand is about giving you opportunities to think and experience differently and to change tack and change your mind and revise and rethink. That we'd created a space where we could do that, and actually it got a reception that it might not otherwise have done. In others, somebody else putting it out might have said, this doesn't fit with what, this isn't punk, it's not what it's about, what's this not? I think that was a verification that we'd created this, albeit very small space, and a group of people who sort of trusted us and went, wow, and therefore looked at it openly and embraced it. We had, as I said, been careful with the brand to set up this space where it was about being open and being curious and investigating. So, if you will, we were able to kind of we were like explorers. The brand was an explorer for people, and we helped people explore. But it's like I said earlier. in retrospect, I mean, I don't, however many years later it is now, we're talking about it. With no disrespect to you, there are other people talking. I mean, people are still really interested in this stuff. In fact, if anything, even more than they were. And you have to, you do have to sit back and you have to try and think, well, how is that the case? Now, actually, at the time, I did think it was incredibly important. Myself at that age would not have been surprised to find that 30, 40 years on, this mattered. Myself now is very, very surprised to find that it matters. But at that time, I believed it mattered. I'm not quite sure where I was going with that thought, but anyway. But no, so I think that I believed it mattered, but I believed that changing our mind was very important. But this stuff dropped, on one level, this stuff did just drop into my lap. I set up stall, said, here's the attitude, and it just dropped into my lap. It was very informal, and I think there was a sense that just by turning up at the flat, you were part of it and you were involved, which, again, I think is not uncommon in these odd moments where somebody facilitates some. I mean, it sounds very hippie rather than punk, but you're at some intersection of cultural and political energy, and quite often there's just some entity or person who happens to be there at that intersection, and you can kind of facilitate it, and it all feeds on itself and becomes something. So, although it seems as absurd on one level, yeah, there was this flat, and it did have that kind of. It's been very written about. All sorts of people write about what happened. I can't remember half of it, obviously. Davey in particular and Rab. Subsequently the Scars were particularly strong figures in the whole thing, and they were what was very interesting is that they were both incredibly intelligent and articulate, and completely at that point not tainted by any formal cultural expectation or education. And that was, if you will, that kind of attitude, and they were the exemplars of it, and there were many other people around who were part of that same attitude, was something that I found very energizing and was consistent with the way, with our brand, we wanted to transgress any idea of what was formally considered good or intelligent or clever, because my view was that lots of mainstream, apparently formal, high art and culture was actually pretty fucking dim-witted. And that was my starting point, to go back to where we were talking about earlier. And so we had a bunch of kids and people around there who, would bring me sparks of insight and intelligence that, outshone anything you would be finding in the academies at the time. I don't know. I mean, it's important to understand how tribal things were at that point, particularly locally. There were lots of people making music who thought that the label should release their music, and were deeply offended that they didn't. And at that time, I was not unfamiliar with violence as a consequence of that. There were street fights about this stuff. People cared. This stuff mattered, and you were dealing with people who didn't necessarily respect or have access to any, as it were, respectable dispute resolution procedure. And so, these were really tribal things and very intensely felt and experienced. And that's just important to, people, if you don't understand that, it's difficult to perceive how tight-knit, when you encounter someone who seems to be on the same wavelength, how tight-knit that bond is. I think what the label had done at that point, and its presence in the city, enabled people like Rab or Davey and others to believe in themselves in a way that they may not have done otherwise. But I think it was, that's as big a claim as I would make. I think then, though, there was, in the case of the Scars, there were certainly things that they had that were perceived as contrary to orthodoxy, because as we discussed earlier, punk very rapidly became a set of very orthodox ideas. So their whole toying with glamour and the idea of being attractive and sexy and glamorous was something that absolutely I encouraged them. And I think one of the reasons the scars made sense to me, you suddenly see it's just the same as the reason Being Boiled immediately made sense to me was because I'd been listening to Bootsy and Parliament. For whatever reason, I can very clearly remember seeing Roxy Music on the Old Grey Whistle Test. I don't know how I saw it or when, but that moment was why when I first saw the Scars actually play, and I think even from the beginning, Paul Research would notoriously turn up in pink leather boots and God knows what. That was my reference point where I get this. And of course, as a different phase of what we're doing, it was extraordinarily exciting to see kids who'd just been lurking around in your flat suddenly doing stuff that seemed to be taking some of the ideas we were playing with a whole nother step forward. And I still really love the Scars single. It was an underrated release, I think.